Today we're going to be welcoming Professor Rogers M. Smith to CULA. Professor Rogers M. Smith is an American political scientist and author based at the University of Pennsylvania, where he specializes on American political constitutional thought and citizenship. His most recent book, This Is Not Who We Are, Stories of Populism and Peoplehood, builds on a common theme throughout much of his work, that of political communities and the narratives they mobilize, to argue that nationalist populist politicians have been more successful at telling these stories than liberals. In turn, he offers insights on how liberals can reconstruct their own stories of peoplehood to compete with the populist challenge. Thank you, Professor Smith, for coming to talk to CULA. We are delighted to host you, and we hope this evening's talk is engaging and fruitful for everyone involved. So we'll start with a quick address from Professor Smith. He's got his PowerPoint, and he'll be discussing his work, and then we'll move on to an audience-guided dialogue whenever he's ready to do so. Please do send in your questions to the private chat function, either to the direct CULA account or to myself, and Laura and I can process and ask them as we go. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining, and Professor Smith, when you're ready, you can take it away.
Thank you so much. Let me start the PowerPoint. Is it showing now on your screens?
Not quite, not yet.
All right, well then I must not have hit the screen share properly. Just give me a second here to see if I can make that happen for us all.
Stella/Laura, there's sometimes permissions turned off, or you have to turn on permissions for screen sharing.
They're on. Yeah, there we go.
Fantastic.
How are we now?
Yep, that's good.
Excellent. Okay. Well, the kind invitation from your speaker's officer, Stella, said you were, quote, interested in my insights on constitutional politics as well as civil liberties in America and their relationship to racialized and gendered conceptions of citizenship. She also generously stated that this is an opportunity to discuss my recent book, That Is Not Who We Are, Populism and Peoplehood. And she stressed in good liberal fashion that I was very welcome to decide myself what to discuss. Reflecting on this cornucopia of opportunities, I've decided to focus on a problem that bedevils liberals in the United States, and I believe also in the UK and in many other parts of the world. This is the problem of the relationship of liberalism to nationalism, especially in those nations which ruled empires until just 2 generations ago, many of which up to 3 generations ago justified their empires in part by appeal to doctrines of racial and religious superiority, which usually also involved endorsements of patriarchy and rather predatory forms of capitalism. Both the United States and the United Kingdom are undeniably such nations. Let me note briefly that there was a time in the late 18th and early 19th centuries when there appeared to be no problem in the relationship of political doctrines that we now see as early forms of liberalism and then emerging nationalist movements. Early liberalism and nationalism were most often seen as allies in opposing monarchical and aristocratic political, economic, and social privileges, and in enhancing popular power, rights, and opportunities. The American revolutionaries contended they were fighting for inalienable human rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and government by the consent of the governed, as they sought national independence from the British Empire. The French revolutionaries soon overthrew their monarchy in the name of the rights of man, and also the people of France. In Britain, nationalist sentiments were similarly aroused on behalf of liberal reforms. But as British liberal Democrats know well, all these liberal nationalisms were associated with the imperial governance of largely peoples of color, including indigenous communities in North America, Africa, and Asia. Not only racial propagandists like Comte de Gobineau and religious evangelists like America's Reverend Josiah Strong, but also 19th century liberal thinkers like John Stuart Mill, to whom I'll return, claimed that these non-white populations were barbaric due to biological, providential, or cultural factors, these barbarians were supposedly better off governed by nations in which full citizenship was largely confined to white Christian men. So in the 19th century, both liberalism and nationalism were generally, though not exclusively, blended with ideologies of racial, religious, and gender superiority that pervasively shaped the laws and institutions of those societies. In the UK, moreover, doctrines of hereditary class superiority persisted, even among many who saw themselves as liberals, while in the US, many of the 19th century capitalism's industrial and financial nouveau riche saw themselves as a superior class. It is and must be central to 21st century liberalism to repudiate all these ideologies of superiority in the forms of nationalism and national policies and institutions that have embodied them. That means, however, that 21st century liberalism is effectively at war with many of the inherited ideologies, institutions, and practices that have given millions of their fellow citizens their senses of identity and worth, as well as in many cases, their economic interests. The battlefronts of that war are many, with conflicts over transnational institutions like the European Union and the World Trade Organization, over immigration, and over domestic multicultural policies, perhaps the most prominent fronts. The result has been the resurgence in many countries, including many European countries, of nationalist movements commonly called populist, and movements that Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, openly celebrates as illiberal. As Britons and Americans both know, however, many of these populist nationalists are more the beneficiaries of systems of race, gender, religious, and class privilege than they are representatives of all the people for whom they claim to speak. Still, we liberals have a major disadvantage in these contests today. Our opposition to many traditional forms of nationalism, though just, comes across as opposition to many of the people of our nations. And that's not a great way to win broad popular support. I've therefore argued for some time, including in my most recent book, that liberals must offer what I call stories of peoplehood that can compete for popular allegiances with traditional forms of nationalism. In my highly technical academic terminology, I call those traditional forms of nationalism bad stories of peoplehood. And I say liberals need good stories of peoplehood. What's a good story of peoplehood? By liberal standards, to be good politically, stories must succeed in engaging and motivating people. But to be good morally, they must advance the core values that liberal Democrats defend. I've suggested this means good liberal democratic stories of people must have three features that I call the 3 R's of peoplehood narratives. First, they must resonate with many of the pre-existing senses of identity, values, and interests possessed by the people they're trying to persuade. These include their senses of distinctive national identities and traditions, even if not all aspects of those identities and traditions can be embraced. Second, good stories must be respectful of the dignity of all persons in keeping with core liberal democratic principles. And third, they must be what I call reticulated stories, by which I mean they must build respectful diversity into both the national narratives and the national policies and national institutions they advance. They must not favor uniformity or homogeneity, but must instead treat all people in equitable fashion, recognizing their diversity of experiences, values, and needs. That's a complex task that many liberals shirk in the name of equality. They instead push for policies that purport to treat everyone identically, but in so doing, often they only perpetuate many forms of inequality and oppression. For example, late 19th century US policies assigned Native Americans the same individual property rights that white citizens had. But in so doing, they assaulted the communal forms of property that were at the center of many Native American ways of life. Good stories of national peoplehood must be retold in ways that not only permit, but celebrate accommodation of a wide range of diverse ways of life among a nation's citizens. How can we persuade citizens of liberal democratic societies to embrace, accommodate, even celebrate diversity in their national stories and national policies? Here, I've suggested we must modify the famous maxim of your great 19th century liberal John Stuart Mill, who said society must use coercive power over its members only to prevent harm to others. Today, I believe we must encourage societies and individuals to adopt the maxim that the best uses of their social and individual powers are those that actively aid others while not harming themselves. If liberals are seen as supporting policies that recognize diverse identities and needs and seek to aid all or as many as possible, and if liberals enthusiastically endorse stories of national identity that commend such recognition, aid, and accommodation, they may not be seen by so many as fundamentally enemies of many of their people and their nation. Now, that's all pretty general, I know, but the kinds of stories I'm talking about have to vary in every particular national context, or else they will not resonate with that nation's people. In the US, I've argued Americans should build on the stories of national identity and purpose told by mid-19th century anti-slavery leaders like Lysander Spooner, Frederick Douglass, and Abraham Lincoln. They presented America as a great collective project aimed at gradually securing over time the inalienable rights announced in the Declaration of Independence for all people of all colors, everywhere, as Lincoln put it. Currently, the Biden administration, for which many of my former students are working, though they haven't consulted me, is following this strategy in its rhetoric and its policies. Its American Rescue Plan and American Job Plan are designed to make the economic rights of all more secure through variegated, targeted, I might even say reticulated measures aimed at indigenous and minority communities, as well as economically depressed geographic regions and industries. The Biden administration's For the People Act is seeking to make political rights of all more secure. And in his calls to create a more perfect union, Joe Biden regularly urges Americans to carry forward the Declaration of Independence project of making the pursuit of diverse forms of happiness more possible for everyone. Now, Biden certainly has not won and is not likely to win the support of all Americans. But his liberal democratic national story of American peoplehood is getting broad enough support to give hope that it will have real and enduring successes. What are the comparable stories of peoplehood that liberal Democrats should advance in the UK today? That's something for you to decide. And I'd really like to hear your thoughts. My message for you today is simply that liberal stories of national peoplehood are probably necessary today in the UK, as in the US and elsewhere, if the forces of illiberal nationalism are not to dominate our countries and much of the world in the 21st century. So that's my presentation. And now I look forward to your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Professor Smith. That was incredible. Thank you so much. So I thought we would start with just a quick reminder to everyone in the audience. If you have any questions, please do send them either to Laura or to me. You can send them either through the public chat or through the private chat function, and we will process them and ask. I thought we'll just start off with quite a broad question. First 110 days of the Biden administration, what are your thoughts? How is this compared to the last 4 years, and how is that story of peoplehood, which you've started kind of telling us a little bit about, how would you evaluate it and predict how its future is going to be looking like?
So far, the Biden administration has had 2 great successes. It has a lot of trouble ahead of it, though. The 2 great successes are passing the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan. This is the largest piece of national economic assistance and stimulation really since the New Deal in America. And simultaneously, they've had tremendous success in distributing vaccines and beginning to break the back of the pandemic in America. And those are the two biggest problems facing the United States today. So those are significant successes, and it is noteworthy that Joe Biden was hardly a left-leaning or even FDR kind of Democrat through most of his career. He was very much a centrist. It is consistent with the arguments of political science in the American political development field, in which I toil, particularly the arguments of Stephen Skowronek, that we appear to be at a time when external conditions are leading Joe Biden to be much more of a transformative president than I think he ever anticipated being. And certainly I didn't anticipate him ever being that. And he's able to do so in part because we have been living in the modern era under the shadow of the 1980 Reagan Revolution, but the policies of the Reagan era eventually have come to be discredited even amongst Republicans like Donald Trump, who has abandoned the commitment to free trade and the support for relatively generous immigration policies, and also the support for a strong and multilateral international role. But it's characteristic of a dominant regime when it's coming to an end that the last in line often tries to introduce new policies in this way. And it didn't enable Donald Trump to get reelected. Now, the old regime is sufficiently discredited that there's not just room, there's great pressure for the kind of new progressive directions that Joe Biden is adopting. However, there's also tremendous entrenched resistance. Unlike FDR in 1933, when he had tremendous majorities in the House and Senate, the American electoral system now provides for much more disproportional congressional representation of the Republican Party in relation to their share of the popular vote nationally. So they're stronger in the House and Senate than they should be based on popular votes alone. And that means the House and Senate are very closely divided. And it's going to be tremendously difficult for Biden to get the next parts of his plan through. And if he doesn't, then the considerable momentum of his first 110 days may falter. So I'd say he got off to a great start, but things are very uncertain right now.
Thank you. And just latching on to that, just as a quick follow-up to that, there seems to be very much, especially around social media, that's definitely seemed to have amplified that. There seem to be lots of emerging Republican narratives about stopping the steal, and kind of that new maybe kind of almost challenge is a story of peoplehood. Are they likely to prove themselves particularly robust, and how might they be incorporated into broader narratives about what it means to be a populist or be a Republican?
Well, probably the single most depressing thing about American politics in my lifetime is the fact that so many Americans believe something which is so obviously false. And this is only possible because of the combination of heightened polarization and the new communications ecostructure of social media silos in which people have all their views reinforced by the like-minded across the political spectrum in ways that lead them to discount even undeniable facts from different points of view. Now, I want to say, though, that the other factor that has to be acknowledged is that in the United States, the governing elites of both parties supported policies that didn't speak to the anxieties and aspirations of many millions of Americans. And that created an anger and resentment that led to populist support, not only for Donald Trump on the right, but for Bernie Sanders on the left. And so it is true that American political elites and economic elites have discredited themselves to some extent. That means that people are willing to believe falsehoods. It is not going to be possible to persuade lots of the people that believe this narrative that it's false. It is possible that if the Biden administration adopts policies that effectively address people's felt problems, that the percentage of Americans that have such distrust of their governing institutions that they believe that somehow their whole election could be stolen, even though Trump appointed justice officials and Trump appointed judges all say there's no evidence of that. The numbers, the percentage of Americans who are in that category, I think will become smaller, although not eliminated. And it's also true that, I think Liz Cheney, who was kicked out of the congressional leadership yesterday for not supporting the big lie, she's going to try and turn that into a presidential campaign of her own. And there are many never Trump Republicans are going to try and join her. That won't satisfy the diehard Trump supporters. But again, it provides another narrative that might shrink the percentage of the population that buys that story. I think, though, that the Biden administration has to tell their own positive narrative and have positive results that get people to believe that narrative. And it should be the kind of narrative I was just discussing. The one other point to make, though, is that as is well publicized, Republicans at the state level are using this narrative that American elections are rigged in order to pass lots of laws that have vote suppression effects, and that could further magnify how American electoral institutions disproportionately favor Republicans and can allow a party that has minority popular support nonetheless to win a majority of offices. It may not turn out that these vote suppression laws are effective in achieving that goal. They may discourage their own voters as much as they do Democrats, but there is a danger that even if the opponents of the big lie, by and large, win the national narrative, if these state laws are changed and if the changes are effective, that may not prevent the consequences of the big lie, the discrediting of the Biden administration and the Democrats from being effective.
Great, thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting. So my first question is, you mentioned the moral content that you would argue makes a liberal story of personhood a strong one. I was wondering if you'd spent much time thinking about psychologically what kinds of stories make for compelling narratives.
That's a great question. And I probably haven't spent as much time thinking about it as I should. I would say that in addition to the points I made about how you have to tell a story in which people can see themselves, they have to be able to see their identities and values to some extent if they're going to find it persuasive. It has to resonate with them. I have also always been influenced by John Locke's argument that the greatest uneasiness determines the will, and that it is a part of human psychology that ultimately people are going to be motivated by what they think is most dangerous and what they fear most. That gives you a couple of different strategies. You can play to their fears and tell stories that say they're in great danger if they don't join with your side. But you can also change their greatest uneasiness by reassuring them, persuading them that some of their fears are not justified, by reducing their fears rather than playing to their fears. Personally, that's the kind of political narrative I think is preferable. If you can reassure them that a lot of their anxieties are not justified and that it's safe to pursue their best aspirations, that is, I think, in many ways a more desirable story. But you have to be aware that, as I think a lot of recent politics confirms, those narratives may be less effective than those which are inflaming people's fears and anxieties. I think we've seen that in both our countries. And if that is the, if that's what's going on, at some point, you got to make people more scared about the other guys.
Okay, now I think we're going to be quickly jumping back to the US context, but equally, this is a question that is pretty much internationally applicable for 2020. It was a really interesting year for political action within civil society, things like the Black Lives Matter movement really taking off. Internationally, we equally saw kind of the explosion of that here in the UK. I'm a native in Portugal, saw kind of the action of that there. And to what extent would you say have social justice movements in the recent years provided more compelling, perhaps, and more effective stories of people than liberal politicians? And particularly if they were in an international scale, what kind of strategies are they using to provide those? And then on top of that, and I will just, this is becoming a huge Franken question, but can these stories be effectively co-opted by liberal politicians? And if so, have they taken advantage and are they doing that?
Not well enough, I would say, in answer to the last part. It is true, I believe, that a whole variety of transnational social justice movements are effectively telling stories about who they are and what people should be loyal to that are more effective than, in particular, many liberal national stories. And I think that's fundamentally because, as I noted briefly, liberal national stories are tied to a history of global imperialism, especially European imperialism, including Portugal. That a lot of these social justice movements are united by the sense that they are different peoples and communities that have been various ways been oppressed historically by imperialist forces, and that they're engaged in a transnational and international efforts to break down all the legacies of imperialism and colonialism that still produce enormous racial, economic, and religious inequalities and injustices. And so these accounts, I think, give people both a sense of justified grievance and a sense of urgent anxiety about the need to transform global power structures. They're also effective because in significant measure, they're true. People, they resonate with people's experiences because we do have global structures of inequality that reflect legacies of imperialism. It is important to understand, however, that those colonial imperialist legacies are not the whole story. They're not the whole story within nations, and they're not the whole story across nations. We Americans like to, or I think we should like to emphasize the fact that while the people who wrote and adopted the declarations of independence were not prepared to live up to its opening rhetoric, nonetheless, those principles of rights for all became great instruments of reform movements in the United States, used by abolitionists, used by women's movements, used by workers' movements, used in the modern era by gay rights and disability movements, used throughout American history to push for change, sometimes successfully. The truth is that the Declaration of Independence has been adapted by revolutionary movements around the world. And that too is a legacy of the experience of these nations. It is true that England was seen for centuries as the freest country in the world in ways that were, I think, never strictly true, but nonetheless served as a source of inspiration for reform movements as well. And what I think liberals need to do is acknowledge the realities of white settler colonialism and imperialism in the American experience and imperial governance by Britain, Portugal, Spain, France, Germany, Denmark, and others. Acknowledge all that, but say, we are building on the parts of our national traditions and values that call for transformation, emancipation, and progress. It's an incomplete story to think that our national identities only contain imperialist oppression. We're going to build on the better elements and can do that in solidarity with various kinds of social justice movements.
Thank you. I was wondering this, I'm not sure if you even would agree with me that these are two different types of stories, but I would just be interested to know if you could talk a bit about the difference between top-down kind of stories, I guess a bit like Stop the Steal, which are really born in the political class and then sold to their followers, versus, I guess, what you could consider a more bottom-up analytic approach that involves finding out what your potential voters care about and then playing to those preferences, a bit like what the Brexit movement in the UK was born from.
Yeah, I don't have a sharp distinction between bottom-up and top-down stories because I think all effective stories have elements of both, but you can arrange them along a spectrum, and some are more top-down and some are more bottom-up. And I think you gave some good examples just then of how that contrast can be drawn. No story can be purely top-down, however, because if it doesn't connect with what people care about, fear, experience, it's just not going to work. For that matter, elites just aren't that imaginative. If they're going to be able to craft a story, they have to draw on broader cultural understandings and elements in order to come up with the raw materials for the story. I grew up in the state of Illinois, one of the most famously corrupt states in the United States. In my lifetime, 5 different governors of Illinois have been indicted and convicted, and they're from both parties, and they probably a couple more should have been. And so the perception that elections are rigged was a commonplace in Illinois when I was growing up. Chicago Democrats did it, suburban Republicans did it. So the Stop the Steal story built on elements that were there, although it was certainly propagated as a top-down story primarily in the way that you just said. Conversely, bottom-up stories always need spokesmen, and I tend to think when I think of leaders or elites, I use more the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci's notion of public intellectuals, and it's a definition under which is Martin Luther King's top down or bottom up. He's a spokesman for a social movement, and every social movement needs spokesmen. And I think that therefore there's always an elite leadership or top-down component to articulating even stories that come up from below. But I definitely think, as I suggested earlier, that contemporary elites, and maybe particularly liberal elites, have been too top down. They haven't been sufficiently connected with enough of the sort of grassroots feelings, sentiments, fears and hopes. And so they haven't crafted stories as successfully as they might have done. And I don't exclude myself from that shortcoming. So.
Okay, so we've got a question from someone in the audience, which we thought we'd include here as it's quite topical. On the point of leadership, is there a relationship between stories of peoplehood and charisma or personality? And is there an inherent connection between what the story says and how it's told? So I think I just said this question is from Peter in the audience.
Hi, Peter. Thank you for the question. Certainly, there are more charismatic storytellers than others, and they do communicate more effectively. Ronald Reagan had, known as the great communicator, was essentially telling the same story in 1964 that Barry Goldwater was telling. But Barry Goldwater, who didn't lack in charisma, but he wasn't as charming as Reagan, he went down to a disastrous electoral defeat, while Reagan's speech on Goldwater's behalf catapulted him to national prominence. And he was elected governor of California 2 years later, and eventually president of the United States. But I'd also note that Reagan failed in several efforts to get elected president of the United States. And he needed a better story than what he had in 1964 or 1968. And the story he had in those years was essentially a 2-part story that didn't serve to build as broad a coalition. It was a story of laissez-faire economics and tough anti-communist national defense and foreign policies. It was military and economic conservatism, and that was mostly what he talked about. That's mostly what Goldwater talked about. In the 1970s, he added much more of an emphasis on America as a city on the hill, as proclaimed in, or as derived, I should say, from John Winthrop's sermon to the Puritans. And that added a more religious, providentialist component to his story. And he also began emphasizing more than he had in the past the notion that America should be a colorblind society in ways that appealed to racial conservatives, that helped the movement of conservative whites from the Democrats in the South to the Republican Party. He thereby built a broader coalition, and that got him to the White House, and it reshaped American politics for the next generation. So the storyteller matters, yes, but the content of the story matters as well. Probably the latter two elements, though, only became so effective for him in the 1970s when religious and racial conservatives were reacting against the successes of Great Society liberals in the 1960s. And so I have to add that you also need external conditions under which that story resonates. So, by the way, if any of my answers are not satisfactory, you should feel free to push back and or ask further questions. I don't, it's illiberal to be too deferential.
Well, I have a question that relates to that one. I was wondering whether you think that your theory of narrative as being central to political success works for individuals as well as movements, but not in the sense that they can sell a collective story well in order to promote particular policies, more that they can construct a good personal story, like an origin story for themselves that people can buy into. And perhaps if you had anyone you could think of who's done that particularly well.
Well, I think that for people to have success in politics, in some systems more than others, in the American system more than the parliamentary system of Britain, but still, I think it's true to some degree everywhere. You need an individual story that is compelling and effective, but it is only going to be effective if it's an individual story that does reflect and reinforce your larger story in which your constituents can see themselves and their shared identity and their national identity in many cases. I've written in the past about how there's a certain challenge in telling your personal story. You both want to, in democratic societies, say you're a representative person. You're like everybody else, you know. George W. Bush, you're a guy that people can have a beer with, assuming that most people want to have a beer. At the same time, you also have to present yourself as not like everyone else, but as special and talented in some ways. And that's a challenge, but it's a challenge that many politicians have met successfully. And none so better than Donald Trump, who has told a story of in which he allegedly has amazing business success in all fields. The fact that he was a multimillionaire from the age of 3 on is not understood by many of his followers who see him as a self-made man, and he has propagated that image. So he presents himself as extraordinary, but guess what? He's this extraordinary guy who is who drives through McDonald's and buys cheeseburgers, and you know, who doesn't talk in an officious, formal way, but seems, you know, down to earth, and that has inspired a level of popular support and belief that is, in fact, more intense than any other political figure in my lifetime in the United States. So he has told his personal story extraordinarily effectively. He spends more time on his personal story than on anything else. It looks like Boris Johnson has also to some degree presented himself as exceptional, but also has the common touch and all that. And I should note that Barack Obama made his personal story central to his political appeal, but in speeches that always connected it with the American story as he saw it. And again, that's what they all have to do as well.
I will follow up on that briefly because I was just about to ask about Barack Obama. How would you say, could you elaborate a little bit more on how he kind of presented his story of peoplehood? Because if I recall correctly, your recent book, This Is Not Who We Are, does feature some reference to Obama and the way in which he presented his own narrative. So could you elaborate on that for us a little bit?
Well, I've talked about Obama since he emerged in national politics, and he did so in 2004 with an extraordinary Democratic National Convention speech. Both Obama and Reagan burst on the national stage with speeches that instantly made them famous and soon led them to higher office. And if you look at that 2004 speech, Obama gave variants of it through the rest of his career. It is quite explicitly his personal story, and he connects it to the American story. And his personal story is of extraordinary diversity. He embodies in his personal individual background and his family racial diversity, religious diversity, national diversity, and he indicates that all that diversity can be a source of strength and unity and not a source of division and animosity. And he promised America that that could be true of our national story as well. The famous line from the 2004 speech is that, there's not a red America, there's not a blue America, there's not a white America, there's not a black America, there is just the United States of America, and that our diversity is part of our strength. That story was enormously appealing to Americans and definitely got him elected. He then ran into problems because he didn't feel it was politically possible for him to govern as progressively or as far to the left as Joe Biden is doing right now. His personal politics have actually probably always been to the left of Joe Biden's, but they're operating differently in office. And that was because I think Obama, having had the experience of successfully winning broad support by claiming to be able to find common ground without suppressing diversity through kind of deliberative democratic processes. He had too much faith that that would work. Adamant Republican opposition meant that it didn't work. And he was also probably cautious, shocked himself that a person of modern African descent had been elected president of the United States. He was cautious about appearing too liberal or too far to the left. And he adopted policies that just weren't big enough to address a lot of the nation's problems. He conceded a lot to more conservative perspectives. And so, unfortunately, in the end, although he remained and remains personally popular, he didn't build a broad coalition for really extensive change. And again, under different circumstances, Biden has been able so far to do more.
Great. I have a question that's from Luke, and that's asking whether you've had a lot of pushback, I assume mostly from liberals, about the idea that we can have a positive national story.
Yes, I think that there are certainly people on the academic and political left in the United States who see my kind of argument as basically a non-starter. And at the same time, most of them would acknowledge that the prospects of the United States electorate rallying around a strongly anti-nationalist left story are pretty low. So they're not enthusiastic about what I want to say. They don't clearly have an alternative. The unfortunate thing, I think, is that too many on the left are sufficiently pessimistic, really, about progressive change, that it becomes more important to make it clear the depth and strength of your commitment to social justice than it is to do what might actually be necessary to achieve greater social justice. So yeah, there's certainly people on the left that think any talk about a better national story is still buying into a centuries-long global imperialist national world system, and we need to transform it. I think we need to transform it, but I do think we have to think seriously about what will actually work to transform it. And, you know, from my biased point of view, that's where the difference is.
We've got a question which links up really quite well with that, and that's coming from Ben. So as you've noted in your earlier work, there's a generally held understanding that American civic ideals are fundamentally liberal. Do you think this means Americans will resist the notion of differentiated rights for different groups?
I think the answer is yes, but I still want to quarrel with the question in two ways. The first is that I don't believe it is true that American civic ideals are at heart liberal. I think it's true that liberal ideals are part of America's civic ideals, but I also think they've always been contested. There's always been, you know, Joe Biden likes to talk about a battle for the soul of Americans, America. In his best speeches, he says that all the participants in this battle are Americans. The view that Americans should be a white Christian nation is a genuine American civic ideal. It is deeply believed in by millions of Americans and has been all through US history. It is, I think, not true that America's civic ideals are liberal at their core. At their core, they're a contest in which liberal ideals are important ones. But it is true, and I think it's to be, should be a source of national pride, that liberal ideals have become more prominent amongst in conceptions of American national identity over time. Those have been hard-fought battles. They might be reversed. They've been reversed before, but it is true that they're stronger now. It's also true, as the question rightly suggests, that many versions of those liberal ideals are hostile to differentiation or what I call in this book reticulation, deliberately trying to get people to think about differential treatment in a fresh way because there is a lot of opposition to it. The opposition is, in my mind, ironic because the reality is that American citizenship laws, all American laws, have been shot through with differentiations all through our history, and they still are. And many of the differentiations are considered perfectly reasonable. You know, we do differentiations on the basis of age. You know, we don't allow small children to vote. We often provide special social privileges to the elderly. You know, once you turn 65 in Philadelphia, you can ride the public transit system for free, regardless of your income level. And that's thought an appropriate sort of recognition of what are presumed to be long lives of contributions, as well as perhaps mounting physical frailties. I can and have gone on at great length about how extensive these differentiations are. Some are good and some are widely supported and thought good. Some have, are widely and appropriately condemned as unjust, invidious. But I think we do need to, for 21st century democratic theories, to recognize that differentiation always has been and always will be a reality. The only debate, it's not whether or not to have differentiation, it's what differentiations are good and what differentiations are bad. I've been trying to make that case, and I'm continuing to try and make it in my scholarship. It does get a lot of pushback. At the same time, I would say there's more acceptance of it now than there was 25 years ago. And so who knows what the next 25 years may bring.
I will just quickly, just with a quick anecdote here from CULA with regards to your reference of voting age. I will not name any names, but there are various members of the society who are pro-abolishing voting age altogether. As I said, we will not be naming any names, so I'll just be moving on simply to the next question.
Well, I do want to affirm that there are a number of political theorists that are criticizing voting age restrictions, and I think it's a reasonable case to make. But what I wanted to emphasize is simply that this is a long accepted form of differentiation. Even though we say we're for equal citizenship, actually we've accepted this differentiation forever, and most people still do.
Thank you. Okay, so just now quickly moving on to maybe something that's a little bit more topical in terms of our current context, but also just zooming out broadly to think of crisis events. To what extent can crisis events, so here we're thinking things like 9/11, maybe the COVID-19 pandemic, or the 2008 financial crisis, how could they destabilize or maybe alter stories of peoplehood? Can they, can they strengthen them, and what factors determine which factors determine how these crises will impact stories of peoplehood, whether they're weakening or strengthening them?
Well, my former colleague, David Mayhew, a really great political scientist, has long made the argument, not always popular with other political scientists, that we just have to accept that external events are often significant independent variables in transforming political processes and political development. Yes, exogenous circumstances, events, they can challenge existing narratives, and they can be the basis for new narratives. I once helped advise a dissertation on the consequences of the earthquake in Mexico City about a half century ago. And one consequence of that earthquake was to discredit the denials of political rights of self-governance to the residents of Mexico City, who were governed by the national government and didn't have much in the way of their own municipal self-governance powers, because it became clear that the national government was not looking after them. They were vulnerable to the earthquake, and especially the poorer portions of the city where the buildings were not constructed in ways that could withstand a natural disaster. And that made it harder to defend the status quo. Now, it didn't determine what alternative narrative would prevail, however. Events rarely are so clear that they're effectively self-interpreting. They play into an ongoing politics of competing narratives in ways that they can't be ignored, but they don't necessarily control the narrative. You know, Amartya Sen is very famous for the argument that famines are always, not just sometimes, they're always the products not really of natural disasters, but of the failure of human institutions to cope with natural developments. But even if you accept that, and he had to work hard to get people to accept that premise, then the question is, well, what are the failures in human institutions and policies that turn a bad weather season into a famine? Of course, there are rival interpretations of that. So events matter, but you can't clearly predict how they will matter politically, because in part that depends on the contingencies of the responses of political actors in crafting interpretations effectively. There's probably more to be said about how events shape and constrain narratives of peoplehood and political narratives more generally. But I think that's about as much as I know to say at this point.
So our very last question, we've been asking this to all of our speakers this term, is if you could have one magic policy that just passes, instantly sails through government and becomes law, what would you pick?
I'm afraid it has to be a comprehensive program to combat climate change. Not perhaps the most glamorous choice, but let's face it, that's the biggest existential crisis facing humanity today. So that has to be it.
Fantastic answer. The last two speakers we've had have made themselves instant friends of CULA with their answers. So we've had climate change, previously we had housing policy. And those are notably two subjects which notoriously agitate the Lib Dems. So I think that wraps us up for this evening. Thank you so much, Professor Smith, for coming to speak to us. It's genuinely been a pleasure. And we will hopefully be putting together your advice on Stories of Peoplehood to really help bolster the Lib Dems in the future and really continue to activate liberalism in the UK. Thank you everyone for joining, and I hope you've enjoyed the evening. And this should be up on our YouTube account quite soon.
Well, thank you all. I really appreciate the invitation and have enjoyed the discussion.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.